Hey folks, I'm Phoebe de Vere, and I'm here to answer your top questions about who really wrote Shakespeare. This should give you some basic orientation around why the Shakespeare authorship question exists, and the case for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, as the real author of the plays. Why are people questioning who wrote Shakespeare? Is this just an internet conspiracy theory? So there's actually been widespread skepticism about who really wrote Shakespeare's plays since at least the 1800s, when people started to notice that the plays seemed to be full of references to the inner workings of Queen Elizabeth's court. It's almost as though they were Saturday Night Live-style roasts of various prominent officials written from inside the palace itself. The plays demonstrated intimate knowledge of sensitive foreign policy scandals, and the author seemed to have traveled extensively through the royal courts of Italy and France. The few facts that we had about the commoner William Shakespeare seemed so mismatched from the content of the plays that it was almost as though his name had been placed there as a deflection from the royal gossip that's being spilled. Suddenly there was a massive craze, and nearly every major public intellectual of the day is weighing in on the lack of documentary evidence that William Shakespeare had even known how to read. Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens, felt certain that Shakespeare had to be a pen name as well, and he wrote an entire book deconstructing the traditional biography of the Stratford man, calling it an Eiffel Tower of artificialities. Henry James wrote, "I am haunted by the conviction that the divine William is the biggest and most successful fraud ever practiced on a patient world." Today, institutions are still dominated by the traditional narrative, but you can find plenty of Edward de Vere fans amongst celebrities, teaching at top universities, and even directing at the Globe Theatre. Just last year, Stanford professor Rima Greenhill published this book, demonstrating how Love's Labour's Lost is actually a spoof of the failed marriage negotiation between Queen Elizabeth and Tsar Ivan the Terrible of Russia in the 1570s. This is a time when Will of Stratford-upon-Avon would have been about 10 years old, and in Stratford-upon-Avon. So how did his name end up on the play? It sounds kind of crazy, but it seems like in later years, when the plays actually started getting published outside of court, Edward de Vere hired him to use his name. A poet of the time refers to Shakespeare as our English Terence, and Terence was a popular playwright from ancient Rome. Members of the public knew Terence as a freed African slave in his early 20s, but people in the Roman aristocracy knew that this young man Terence had been hired by a high-ranking patrician senator who wanted to remain anonymous as he published his scandalous works. Terence's plays have prologues that actually wink at this arrangement and tease the reader for wanting to know the author's real identity. What's funny about Shakespeare is that people say that he made his money as a playwright, but most of the early manuscripts of his works on the market didn't even have his name on them, so he can't have been making money off of them. What we do know is that Edward de Vere's wife left money in her will for the continued annual allowance of someone she called her dumb man, and that Will of Stratford never made another major purchase after Edward de Vere died in 1604, even though he lived for another 12 years. Who is Edward de Vere, and why have I never heard of him? Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was a prominent courtier of the Elizabethan period. Francis Mears called him the best writer of comedies, and the anonymously penned Art of English Poetry named him as an excellent poet but loath to be known for his skill. He grew up in the house where Ovid's Metamorphosis was translated, and was later adopted by the man who was the model for Polonius in Hamlet. He was an extremely vibrant and notorious personality who made many friends and also many enemies, especially when he was flirting with Queen Elizabeth in the 1570s. I like to imagine someone like Robin Williams just bursting with ideas and characters and talking a mile a minute, so not exactly a wallflower. But then why isn't he more widely known? In a nutshell, Edward de Vere ended up embroiled in a controversy that led to his being literally erased from the historical record by his enemies. The hatchet job was done so thoroughly that even in the 1800s, when Mark Twain and everyone are desperately searching for who wrote Shakespeare's plays, they examined many aristocrats, from Francis Bacon to the Earl of Derby to Queen Elizabeth, but Edward de Vere's name doesn't even make the list. And none of the candidates that were put forward were perfect fits, so by the end of the 1800s, the public had kind of given up on the Shakespeare authorship question as a red herring. It wasn't until 1920 that a school teacher named J.T. Loney fished him out of the dustbin of history and published his landmark book, Shakespeare Identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Loney was an outsider, and a lot of people ignored him, but he did convince writers like Sigmund Freud and Vladimir Nabokov, and there even seems to be a reference to Edward de Vere in James Joyce's Ulysses, but it's kind of hard to tell what James Joyce is saying in that book, so I'm not going to count it. I'd love for you to hear some of Edward de Vere's writing that did survive with his name attached. There's a book by an Italian writer named Girolamo Cardano called Cardanus's Comfort that mainstream scholarship has cited for decades as the inspiration for Hamlet's to be or not to be speech. It just so happened that Edward de Vere loved that book so much in Italian that he personally paid to have it translated into English when he was 23. Here's some of what he wrote in his introduction to the English translation. "What doth avail the rose unless another took pleasure in the smell? Why should this rose be better esteemed than that rose, unless in pleasantness of smell it far surpassed the other rose?" This always makes me think of the famous line from Romeo and Juliet's balcony scene, and if you read the whole letter, you can see throughout it his love of metaphor and imagery. Was Will of Stratford actually a real person? And why do people say he was illiterate? Okay, yes, there was a man from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare, although it might have been pronounced Shag-Speare or Shock-Speare. You can see the various alternative spellings of the name here on these 6 kind of scrawly signatures, which are incidentally the only writing we have that's supposed to be from him. A lot of scholars actually think that these signatures were probably written by legal clerks because the hands and the spellings are so different. And the 90% of people who were illiterate in Stratford-upon-Avon would have had to use clerks to sign documents for them. Traditionally, scholars will say that Will went to grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, but that's total speculation as there's zero evidence for this. And as the eldest son from a working-class family, he would have most likely had to go to work. Will of Stratford's parents and siblings were definitely illiterate, but what's crazy is that so were his daughters. And it's hard to imagine that a man who was born illiterate and then self-educated to become the greatest writer of all time wouldn't have had taught his own kids to read. A comparative example is Frederick Douglass, who was illiterate from having grown up in slavery. But once he learned to read and wrote his best-selling memoir, he became a passionate advocate for literacy, and his kids became school teachers or journalists. Isn't it classist to say that a commoner couldn't have written Shakespeare? A lot of people understandably don't like the idea that the real Shakespeare was a fancy aristocrat rather than a man of the people. But the origins of the Shakespeare authorship movement really have nothing to do with class snobbery. Like I said, early adapters were Mark Twain, who worked on a riverboat, or the people's poet Walt Whitman, or even Malcolm X expressed skepticism with the traditional authorship narrative.
I remember one thing he wrote that kind of moved me. He put it in the mouth of Hamlet, I think it was, who said, "To be or not to be." He was in doubt about something.
None of them is saying that someone from a poor background couldn't have written literary masterpieces. They're just saying that these particular literary masterpieces seem to be extremely detailed in their parodies of highly placed officials in Queen Elizabeth's government, or descriptions of the art on the walls of various European palaces. It's interesting to compare Shakespeare's works with those of Ben Jonson, another literary genius of the time who was from a working-class background and who actually worked as a bricklayer. Edward de Vere and Ben Jonson were close friends in real life, but the ways that they approached class on stage were completely opposite. In nearly every Shakespeare play, the main characters are always nobility, and if there are lower-class people for some comic relief, they're goofy and bumbling with names like Bottom, Dogberry, or Snout. Shakespeare consistently reinforces the importance of the monarchy and the feudal order, condemning rebellion in the harshest of terms. By comparison, in Ben Jonson's plays, the main characters are servants or working people who are frequently upending the social order, playing pranks on and outsmarting the obtuse aristocrats who have silly names like Lady Haughty and Sir Diaphanous Silkworm. If you ask me, I think that Shakespeare might have been a bit of a snob, but the scholars who point out that he sounds like an aristocrat, they're just doing their jobs. Didn't Edward de Vere die before some of the plays were written? So you'll hear a lot of orthodox Stratfordians say this, but it's actually totally false. The argument goes that Edward de Vere died in 1604, which is true, and that The Tempest was written sometime after 1604, but that's actually false. E.K. Chambers, who's the Stratfordian scholar who established when all the plays must have been written, he admitted himself that he was working backwards from the Stratford man's lifespan to find the dates. According to him, the source for The Tempest was a personal letter that William Strachey wrote in 1609 about a shipwreck that took place in Bermuda. However, evidence for this is so flimsy that even Stratfordian scholars have started to disavow it in recent years. And Stratfordian scholar David Lindley wrote that there is virtually nothing in common between the play and Strachey's letter. Did Edward de Vere work alone, or was he part of a group of writers? Some people assume that there are other co-authors simply because Shakespeare published dozens of plays, and they're all really amazing, and it's a lot of work for one person to pull off. But those people are underestimating Edward de Vere because not only did he write all those plays, but he wrote a ton of other stuff as well. Poems, prose, and even propaganda, often published under different pen names or just straight up anonymously. Edward de Vere died in 1604, and Will of Stratford died in 1616. But Shakespeare's first folio, which is the first time a lot of these plays are published with anybody's name attached, doesn't come out until 1623. A scholar named Robert Prechter recently demonstrated that the first folio was kind of like a greatest hits collection of the dramatic works compiled by his descendants, and not at all the sum total of Edward de Vere's creative output. So once the world finally recognizes de Vere as Shakespeare, there's a lot of other great writing under other pseudonyms that can be united as a broader canon. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe for more, and let me know your questions about who really wrote Shakespeare.